Welcome, and thank you to everyone joining us on the 40th anniversary of the Day of the Imprisoned Writer for this special briefing to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. The bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission was established with the unanimous consent of the United States House of Representatives in 2008. The Commission is charged with promoting, defending, and advocating for international human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Commission undertakes public education activities, provides expert human rights advice, and encourages members of Congress to actively engage in human rights matters. For the 117th Congress, Representative James P. McGovern is the Democratic co-chair, and Representative Christopher H. Smith is the Republican co-chair. Our panelists for today's briefing, Nadine Faree Johnson, Claire Robinson, and Anna K. Nelson, represent three human rights organizations, PEN America, Scholars at Risk, and Reporters Without Borders, that are members of the Defending Freedoms Project. The Defending Freedoms Project was established by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission to increase attention to human rights abuses by encouraging members of Congress to advocate on behalf of prisoners of conscience, wherever they may be found. Each panelist will give a brief presentation on the ongoing threats to freedom of expression, which will be followed by a moderated panel discussion. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions to the panelists through the Q&A function. Nadine Faree Johnson serves as PEN America's Washington Director. An attorney and advocate with a focus in democracy, human rights, and governance, she has a breadth of experience across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Most recently, she served as Executive Director of the ACLU of Kansas. She's a former United States diplomat whose work spans the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and multilateral affairs. Prior to entering public service, she was a professor of constitutional, international, and intellectual property law at Gonzaga University and a Clemenko Fellow and lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. Claire Robinson is Advocacy Director at Scholars at Risk, where she led Scholars at Risk's efforts to identify, report on, and respond to attacks on higher education communities worldwide. Ms. Robinson developed and oversees the organization's student advocacy seminars. Faculty led teams of students conducting advocacy on behalf of imprisoned scholars and students by the Scholars in Prison Project. She serves on Scholars at Risk's European Coordinating Committee for Academic Freedom and Advocacy, and she was previously Public Information Officer in the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Courts. Anna K. Nelson serves as the Executive Director of Reporters Without Borders, USA. Ms. Nelson directs Reporters Without Borders' activities in the United States, as well as Canada and English-speaking Caribbean nations, and leads a talented team of advocacy communications and developmental specialists, whose role it is to raise awareness of press freedom issues, mobilize donor support, and promote the importance of trustworthy journalism and access to reliable information. Prior to joining Reporters Without Borders, Anna served as the head of communications and public affairs for the International Committee of the Red Cross's regional delegation for the US and Canada. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and honorable members of the Commission, thank you for organizing this timely briefing. My name is Nadine Faree Johnson. I serve as Washington Director for PEN America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression around the globe. Writers and intellectuals can be influential voices that bear witness to inhumanity, unleash empathy, and accelerate political change and social progress. Literature in particular can provide citizens in repressive societies with a window to a different, freer, better future. Authoritarian leaders and those who would join their ilk know this. PEN America's annual Freedom to Write Index provides a count of the writers and public intellectuals held in prison or detention for exercising their freedom of expression. The index focuses primarily on writers of literature, fiction, poetry, essays, academic writing, and online commentary. With these criteria, we found that in 2020, at least 273 writers and public intellectuals in 35 countries were in prison or unjustly held in detention. This was an overall rise from 238 in 2019, one-third of whom were newly imprisoned in 2020. This represents a new level of harassment and oppression by state actors. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the oppressive environment against free expression in many parts of the globe. Governments use the pandemic as an opportunity to further restrict people's speech, imprisoning writers for the ostensible spread of disinformation, a charge often wielded as a cudgel to quash criticism of the state. Under cover of public health concerns, draconian laws were wielded more fervently against those who spoke out, often influential writers. In Bangladesh, political commentator and writer Mushtaq Ahmed was detained in May 2020 and charged for his online writings criticizing his government's handling of the pandemic. Ahmed died in custody after nearly 11 months in jail. And in Uganda, novelist Kakwensa Rakir Abashaija was detained and tortured under charges purportedly related to COVID-19, but more likely about the authorities' displeasure over his novel, viewed as critical of President Museveni. In many countries, those facing spurious charges under supposed national security-related restrictions were excluded from COVID-related furloughs as the pandemic spread. India's Supreme Court ordered 61,000 people released from prison to reduce overcrowding during the pandemic, but not octogenarian poet Varavara Rao. Iran's judiciary released 70,000 people from prison in March of 2020, but the writers, artists, and others whose cases we champion were not among them. The top 3 jailers of writers and public intellectuals in 2020 were familiar and perhaps expected: China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Yet we see these oppressive practices in every region, in solidly authoritarian states and in ostensible democracies. The situation in some countries deteriorated rapidly last year. Belarus did not appear at all in the 2019 Freedom to Write Index, but catapulted to the top 5 in 2020 after a fraudulent election sparked mass protests. The Lukashenko regime moved quickly to silence writers and the creative class in particular, fearing their reach and their influence. The numbers of writers and public intellectuals in prisons increased elsewhere as well. In Egypt, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi leads an ongoing and persistent crackdown on freedom of thought and expression. Researcher and freelance journalist Ismail Alexandrani, blogger Ala Abdel Fattah, and poet and songwriter Galal al-Bahri remain unjustly imprisoned. The Vietnamese authorities are targeting individuals associated with professional literary organizations, and Iran is seeing a deepening crackdown on members of the Iranian Writers Association, targeted due to their insistence on upholding the rights to free expression and association. 3 IWA members, Bakhtash Abtin, Keyvan Bajan, and Reza Khandan Mahabadi, are the recipients of this year's PEN Barbie Freedom to Write Award. Perhaps most of note is the situation in India, the country with the most democratic political system ranking in the top 10 in the index. Yet the Modi government is employing authoritarian tactics to silence his critics, rounding up writers in a troubling trend. The detention of poet Rao, columnist Anand Taltumbe, and writers Hani Babu and Gautam Navlakha are a few examples of the dozens of writers in India who face harassment, legal action, and other forms of intimidation at the hands of their government. Against this backdrop of pervasive and growing threats to writers and freedom of expression worldwide, we offer the following recommendations for action by members of Congress. First, recognize that as we are seeing in India, even nominally open political environments are subject to the autocratic whims of their leaders. Giving silent permission to or muted condemnation of regimes such as Saudi Arabia or Egypt sends a loud message to those who would emulate their tactics. With its vocal recommitment to human rights, the US government in both the legislative and executive branches should work alongside allies and employ its leverage to press for the release of writers, artists, and public intellectuals who are unjustly detained, and to demand governments uphold their domestic and international commitments to preserve and protect free expression. Second, we ask that you use your legislative authority to pave the way for streamlined entry into the US for these wrongfully targeted dissidents, and that you support bills offering support and protection to protesters who face persecution abroad, and to the writers, journalists, and other dissidents who live under the threat of gross violation of human rights at the hands of their home regimes. Finally, and with our thanks to the Lantos Commission, we urge members of Congress to commit to engaging with the Defending Freedoms Project. As the newest trusted partner of this commission, PEN America has paired 2 dissidents, both from China. We thank and commend Senator Markey and Representative Good for their efforts on behalf of Xu Zhiyang and Chen Yu. The 16 women and men on our priority list are writers and artists, poets, filmmakers, and musicians. They are well vetted, and we are putting them forward with the permission of their families, who have long suffered knowing the harassment, torture, and injustice that their loved ones face. The credibility and gravitas that members of Congress bring to the campaigns to free these individuals is unmatched. Even with the most recalcitrant of dictators, successful advocacy is possible. Of the 51 jailed writers PEN America has honored with the Freedom to Write Award, 44 have been freed. 2 years ago, PEN America featured the case of writer Stanislav Asayev, imprisoned in Donbass in Ukraine, on the Day of the Imprisoned Writer, which we mark today. Mr. Asayev is free, and in fact, he is currently in New York, standing alongside our colleagues today to advocate on behalf of another writer, Vladislav Yashchenko, in the hope that our efforts will once again enable a writer to walk free. On this point, I will close with a quote from a formerly imprisoned Egyptian writer who was also a Freedom to Write awardee. He said, "Advocacy is everything. When you support imprisoned writers, you are raising their silenced voices again. Thank you for your willingness to use your position to support free expression and raise these voices."
Thank you. And thank you to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this important briefing. Thank you also to my colleagues at PEN America and Reporters Without Borders for their excellent work supporting the right to free expression and those who put themselves at risk in exercising and embracing that right. My name is Claire Robinson, and I'm Advocacy Director at Scholars at Risk, a Defending Freedoms Project coalition member. Scholars at Risk is an international network of over 550 higher education institutions in 40 countries committed to protecting scholars and the freedom to think, question, and share ideas. Since 2011, Scholars at Risk has reported on a global phenomenon of attacks on academic freedom, including freedom of expression, within the higher education sector. These attacks manifest as killings, violence, and disappearances, loss of position and expulsion, travel restrictions, and, as we are discussing today, prosecution and imprisonment. Why target scholars? Scholars question dominant discourse and bring attention to a variety of important issues through their academic work, expression, and association. We as society benefit from their findings, which are made possible by the free space to ask questions and discuss ideas. Over the last decade, Scholars at Risk has documented hundreds of incidents involving the wrongful imprisonment or prosecution of scholars and students. Prosecutions of scholars are typically brought under laws aimed at restricting critical inquiry and expression. These include especially opaque and overbroad blasphemy laws, lèse majesté, civil and criminal defamation, sedition, espionage, national security, and terrorism laws that criminalize the mere expression of opinions or ideas on certain topics without any link to violent or otherwise criminal acts or intentions whatsoever. Such laws raise concern for entire higher education communities in that they sanction and impose artificial boundaries on research and writing, undermining quality, creativity, and innovation that can benefit society at large. They signal to an entire community that certain questions cannot be asked. Looking at it from a global perspective, the imprisonment of a scholar demonstrates a state's lack of respect for, and in some cases even fear of, academic freedom. Without academic freedom, higher education cannot fulfill its role in society, and the quality of education suffers, diminishing the media and human rights spaces, government, and other sectors needed for democracy to function. The university space is foundational, and it must be protected. Keeping in mind that state authorities imprison one to silence all, what are some of these individuals facing? Among the many cases represented by the Defending Freedoms Project, I would highlight Professor Ilham Tohti, an economist imprisoned in China for promoting dialogue between Uyghurs and Han Chinese and speaking out about economic inequalities faced by Uyghurs. Representative James Langevin represents Professor Tohti in the project. Sentencing Professor Tohti to life in prison sends a signal to others that exploring these issues would come with severe consequences. In several cases, scholars are tried by military tribunals or courts whose decisions cannot be appealed, as we have recently seen in Egypt, with postgraduate student Ahmed Samir Santawi, who was detained in apparent connection with his studies on women's rights. In prison, scholars may be held in overcrowded cells or solitary confinement and denied access to legal counsel and family, as conservation scholar Nilofar Bayani has experienced in prison in Iran since 2018. Scholars are often denied appropriate medical care, which is of particular concern during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Sengas, a Bahraini scholar represented in the Defending Freedoms Project, has experienced worsening health without appropriate medical care for his several chronic illnesses, including polio. It cannot be understated the serious damage wrongful imprisonments cause to a scholar's physical and psychological well-being, as well as that of their family, friends, and colleagues. In conclusion, the use of coercive legal actions to punish or deter the individual scholar's words and ideas threatens the heart of higher education and the reason for its existence, and deprives society of important voices that drive progress. Without an open space for research and writing, knowledge production halts. Society is left at a standstill. What happens when there are fewer discussions of economic or religious inequality within minority communities following the imprisonment of Professor Tohti? Or less research on disaster medicine due to Dr. Ahmad Reza Jalali's imprisonment in Iran? Or censured discussions of politics in Belarus following the mass detention of students? The discouragement of research and writing on specific topics through the imprisonment of those who explore these ideas should be alarming to each and every one of us. Scholars at Risk therefore calls on members of Congress to seek the release of imprisoned scholars and call for the implementation of protections for academic freedom. Members can and should become advocates for scholars through the Lantos Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. Congress can also encourage the Department of State to raise concerns about scholars within the context of the UN's Universal Periodic Review. There is a great need for this to signal to states that academic freedom is of critical concern to the United States. To date, there have been fewer than 10 recommendations made regarding scholars as part of the UPR, compared to over 700 regarding journalists or over 900 regarding human rights defenders. And finally, Congress can encourage the Department of State to participate in regional and international efforts to implement protections for academic freedom. We are witnessing a phenomenon of attacks on freedom of expression within the higher education sector. These attacks come at a time of increased authoritarianism across the globe, and this is no accident. We must take collective action to defend the space for inquiry, expression, and debate, to defend the space where we can be free to think. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Nelson. I'm the Executive Director of Reporters Without Borders USA. We are one of the world's largest press freedom organizations, and we work around the globe to defend and protect journalists and press freedom. Thank you, Dana. Thank you to the Tom Lantos Commission and to the Defending Freedoms Project and honorable members for inviting me to speak here today on such an important issue. I'll start out with a glimmer of hope because it's wonderful to be speaking on the same day that Danny Fenster, an American journalist who had been jailed for the past 6 months in Myanmar, was released and will be allowed to come home, thanks to US diplomatic efforts. I am personally thrilled for him and his loved ones, and his release has allowed all of us at Reporters Without Borders, which is known internationally as RSF, so I may use that interchangeably, to breathe a deep sigh of relief. But allow me to be very, very clear. Danny Fenster never should have been put in jail in the first place. His terrible ordeal, which again has lasted almost 6 months, is emblematic of the arbitrary detention that so many journalists face, often on trumped up charges. In Danny's case, the sudden filing of charges against him, which had absolutely no legal basis, and his arrest while trying to come here to the US to be with family, represent a parody of justice committed by the generals in the ruling junta who have behaved like common thugs and bullies since staging a coup in February. Their behavior over the past week clearly demonstrates their total disdain for press freedom and the rule of law, having just condemned Danny to 11 years in prison on Friday. It's a farce. Reporters Without Borders demands that the ruling junta release all other detained journalists in Myanmar, where, according to our latest estimates, at least 47 other media professionals are languishing behind bars. We also estimate that so far, more than 100 members of the media have been arrested since the February coup. That over 100 in Myanmar, but let me zoom out on that number a little and look at an even bigger figure and a more alarming one. According to Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Barometer, worldwide, there are 465 journalists and media workers currently imprisoned because of their work. So while the news for Danny is something to celebrate, we must not forget that well over 450 journalists and media workers are detained at this very moment in direct connection with their work as journalists. In other words, for doing what we tend to take for granted here in the US, for freely expressing their opinions. That figure doesn't include those who are in prison for reasons unrelated to their work. And although we strive to keep our numbers up to date, arbitrary detention is, by its very nature, arbitrary, difficult to track. It can occur over a few hours or several years, and it can involve charges like sexual assault or sedition. Now, who are the worst offenders? Several have already been cited here today. In mainland China, there are 118 imprisoned journalists and media workers, according to our figures, along with 10 in Hong Kong. China is followed by Myanmar, and after that, we have Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, Iran, Belarus, Eritrea, Turkey. What's striking, although not surprising, about these worst offenders is that these same countries tend to rank poorly in Reporters Without Borders' annual World Press Freedom Index. In other words, those nations that tend to put a lot of reporters behind bars also rank poorly in terms of their respect for press freedom. All of the countries I just listed are at the bottom of that index, including China, which is at 177 out of 180. Eritrea comes in at the very, very bottom, the 180th spot. And now I'd like to highlight just a couple of worrying trends that we have noticed at Reporters Without Borders. After a dip between 2017 and 2019 in the number of journalists being jailed, Reporters Without Borders noted an upward trend starting last year, in particular due to the pandemic and the way in which it enabled governments to use COVID-19 and the state of emergency it prompted as an excuse to restrict press freedom and crack down on the media at historically high levels. This visibly contributed to a news and information lockdown, resulting in 4 times the normal average of arrests during the first 3 months of the pandemic crisis. India, which has already been cited, saw judicial investigations opened against no fewer than 48 journalists, 15 of whom were arrested and held between 1 and 4 weeks. We registered 3 times as many arrests of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa between March and May of 2020, the very early part of the pandemic. And that was 3 times the number than the year before. Several countries, including South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, also criminalized the dissemination of false information about the virus, punishing violators with prison sentences. In several Latin American countries, for instance, in Venezuela, those who dared to question the authorities' handling of the pandemic were arrested, accused of disinformation terrorism, and in some cases, jailed. Another trend we're seeing is cybercrime laws, which are leading to an uptick in arrests. They're being used to bypass press freedom laws in order to restrict freedom of speech and in order to detain journalists. For example, in Iran, journalists have been sued and detained for operating seditious channels on the Telegram messaging app. In Cambodia, journalists have been jailed for Facebook posts that allegedly incited chaos. In Benin, the digital code was used to sentence an investigative reporter to 6 months in prison for accurately tweeting comments made by a public prosecutor. Disinformation laws, applicable in particular online, can lead journalists to be jailed in many countries. And right here in the US and the UK, there's a worrying test case for the First Amendment. Let us not forget that although his name provokes anger in some people and empathy in others, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange remains behind bars in Britain after having been indicted by the US Justice Department for multiple counts of violating the decades-old World War I era Espionage Act for the role he played in publishing tens of thousands of classified military and intelligence documents in 2010. Organizations like my own worry that efforts to prosecute him pose a direct threat to the First Amendment and how journalism is practiced in this country, where reporters and editors frequently get a hold of classified information from government and other sources and publish it in the public interest, regardless of whether or not it was supposed to be kept a secret. Like Danny Fenster, Reporters Without Borders believes Assange should never have been jailed in the first place. I'm going to stop there, but I have examples from all of the countries that I have cited with names and more details about the journalist who languishes, probably the best word that we can come up with, on hunger strike, without a sense of hope or any answers as to when they will be set free, and knowing in their hearts, as I do as a former journalist, what an important role journalism plays as a pillar of democracy, as a pillar of security, and as a pillar of stability. We need, and I call on members of Congress to do everything in their power to recognize these trends and to call them out, to work with their allies, as Nadine earlier said, to put pressure on these countries and to put a stop to arbitrary detention. RSF USA will be reigniting a Press Freedom Pact campaign later this or early next year that will provide 10 specific examples of what legislators in this country can do to strengthen press freedom here in the US and abroad. I call on everyone who is listening here today to just remember what the power of journalism is and how important press freedom is to us as a interconnected world. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine, Anna, Claire, for your comments. I wanted to maybe pick up a couple of themes that were coming up in your presentations, and also to remind our audience to submit questions into the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to try to fold as many of them into the conversation as we can. One of the things that each of you have sort of noted is there's, I think in Nadine's words, a pervasive and growing threat to restrictions on freedom of speech as it affects scholars, academics, and writers. And I wondered if we can also, if this can be sort of construed as almost an increasing normalization of restrictions, and that we're seeing a larger, not only larger body, but a growing sense that these types of restrictions are perhaps more and more permissible and more acceptable, and that we're finding them not only in countries and in corners of the world where such restrictions had been the norm, but we're also beginning to see them in democratic countries. And is there perhaps a regression of freedom of expression in places where we hadn't expected to see that before?
I can start that. Thank you so much, Dina. I believe we are indeed seeing a backsliding across the board, even in countries where we had been seeing some progress. I think one good example of that is Tunisia. It had been truly this bright success story from the Arab Spring. It was standing up a vibrant democracy after decades of dictatorship. But in the last few years, we've seen authorities abuse holdover laws from the autocratic era. They have harassed bloggers, they've harassed activists for criticizing the government. And then in 2021, we just saw the president suspend parliament and crack down on any and all opposition. And then I think just last month, the government actually shut down a television station after an on-air host read a poem that was critical of dictators. That's one example. Elsewhere in Africa, the Sudanese people took really great strides toward a democratic future after deposing al-Bashir in 2019. But the recent military coup has really dashed many of those hopes, and probably not surprisingly was followed by a government-ordered 16-day internet shutdown. So I do think that you can see where there have steps that have toward progress, and then this kind of regression where there's been this recalcitrance that we're seeing across the board.
I would echo that that we are seeing exactly a backsliding in places, especially as I said earlier, where COVID has been used as a ruse to crack down even harder than before. And I get this sense personally that authoritarian regimes are testing the fence to see where the weak points are, and then continuing to push a little more. I mean, what we saw of a Belarusian fighter jet over Belarusian airspace, accompanying, essentially hijacking an airplane because they wanted to arrest and detain a journalist on board who was dared to be critical of the government. I mean, to go to those types of lengths, I think suggests a brazenness that we haven't seen. And I think that worryingly, it will continue.
I absolutely agree. We are seeing a reversal in terms of respect for freedom of expression and academic freedom in some countries. Myanmar following the coup, Turkey since at least 2016, Brazil under the government of President Bolsonaro. We've seen an increase in the use of litigation to bully researchers and academics in Poland. We even saw an effort to ban gender studies in Romania through an amendment to the national education law, but thankfully that was annulled last December. But perhaps to piggyback on Anna's message of hope, I will say that we are also seeing more regional and international efforts to bolster academic freedom or freedom of expression. For example, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is currently developing the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, which seeks to provide a framework for states to ensure that their academic freedom laws and practices are in compliance with human rights norms and standards in the region. The former Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, issued a report last year encouraging state action in support of academic freedom. There are efforts underway to address these concerns. But yes, ultimately, I agree with my colleagues. There has been a backsliding.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, you know what, that message, Claire, is, thank you for focusing in on the hope, because I think we're at a place as a society right now where all we hear is doom and gloom, and especially we can feel very powerless as just ordinary citizens. But people here in the US can write to their members of Congress. They can push for change. And so I want everybody who's listening to also understand that they can play a role. And, you know, enough pressure makes a difference. It really does. And we should definitely not walk away from this topic feeling like it's hopeless, because it's not. And Danny did demonstrate that today. So that's a really important message.
I wanted to just note a comment that was posted in the Q&A by Piero Tazzi. In Nigeria, the Cybercrimes Act has been used to jail independent journalists. Luca Bianat just last week, and perhaps by extension to ask if, as we sort of see the rise in citizen journalism and access to the role and access to social media, are we also thinking or noticing that there's a growing vulnerability in terms of who's can be targeted by governments, a larger number of individual journalists and scholars who also might lack institutional support as they're no longer working within organizations, and what that does to the vulnerability that they might face?
I mean, I can just speak to the fact that, yes, I mean, we have detailed reporting from the countries that I mentioned and many more on what we consider professional and non-professional journalists. So we do make a distinction because you know, we see, for example, a non-professional journalist as a citizen journalist, as you said, someone who performs a social function as a journalist, but not in necessarily a professional fashion. And so certainly, for example, with individuals who filmed protests in Syria, and the repression that we saw at the beginning of the Arab Spring and everything that unfolded, you know, targeting of people who were uploading of videos for the world to see. You know, I was remiss earlier in not mentioning American Austin Tice, of course, who's being held in Syria. He's now into his 10th year of being detained there. And obviously we call for his unconditional release as well. But I think, you know, it's a good point. The internet, online platforms, what is in our phone represents an ability, an unprecedented ability for people to record history and obviously current events, but also to be a part of them, and that makes them targets. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how things will evolve to take that into consideration, but I think it is something that we will, as also surveillance by governments, nefarious actors, authoritarian regimes, increases in terms of their capacity, that clearly becomes a real concern in terms of getting the news out safely, no matter who's offering it.
Yeah, I would second what Anna said, and also note that this happens quite a bit where this independent media is under threat, and writers, journalists have no choice but to try to publish elsewhere. They must turn to online commentary to write in the hopes of evading that censorship or a total obstruction of their words. And what we saw in our Freedom to Write Index in 2020 was at least 1/3 of all of the writers and public intellectuals in jail who are jailed that year were regularly publishing their writing and online other commentary online. I think it's a trend that's only going to grow. And to Anna's point, is something that we really need to be watching out for.
For anyone who's really wants to dig into the topic, they can also look up the UN Human Rights Committee and their definition, which looks at journalism as a function shared by a wide range of actors. But they also include in their definition bloggers and those who engage in forms of self-publication. So that would be a good place to start for somebody who is really trying to delve into that topic.
There's a question from Kimberly Stanton. Could the panelists comment on how often the imprisonment of writers, scholars, and journalists in the cases they follow are justified by the misuse of counterterrorism laws or policies?
Who wants to take that?
I can start to say that
Sure.
It's pervasive. I think you really touched upon what is the number one way that these governments are refusing to act in concert with international human rights norms. They rely on national security laws. They rely on terrorism laws. They say that it is because of those issues that they cannot possibly release these individuals. And then we saw it during COVID as well, where you had all of these thousands of people being released, but somehow these writers, public intellectuals, and obviously, of course, journalists and scholars were detained in spite of others being released and under the guise of national security.
Just to echo that, all the time within the world of scholars and students as well. National security laws, anti-terrorism laws, espionage in Iran, in Egypt, China, beyond. It is one of the most common allegations that we hear.
I echo those sentiments.
There's a question from Hena Zuberi about whether or not we should hold democratic countries like India, for example, to a higher standard, especially where so many journalists, writers, and scholars are imprisoned on sedition charges.
I don't know. I think we should hold everybody to a high standard. I mean, maybe that comes across as a little utopian, but I'm willing to go there. That's why my organization exists. We're tenacious. We're not going to let this go. It might take a very long time, but and maybe it's one journalist at a time. But I really, really personally believe that the future of democracy depends on it. And we should hold everyone to a high standard. Why should the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, essentially get away for allegedly having a Washington Post columnist killed it, tortured, and dismembered, and get away with it? No, I think everybody should be held to a high standard, because everybody should aspire to the high standard of what access to reliable information means, to what truthful, trustworthy journalism represents. I think that's also a big threat, that the political divide, the propaganda, the disinformation poses, in addition to all the other things we talked about today, also a very big threat. But we're not going to stop until we can convince everybody of the way of the ideal as we see it.
I agree with that, Anna. Though I would also say that where we have better partnerships and stronger connections, either through university partnerships or other reasons to connect with our counterparts across the globe, I think in those instances we do want to hold ourselves, to a higher standard. Ensure that we use those. Ensure that we engage those that we can in these conversations. And that goes, across sectors.
I think that's a great point. I'd also say that it's my earlier point about what it means to send a message. If we were to hold, say, India to a higher standard, then, for example, Saudi Arabia, then Egypt, then the other countries where we have deep autocratic roots, then that sends the wrong message. That says that you're going to get a free pass if you go too far. We're going to let you go. And that's the last thing we want to do. I think that what we're seeing with this backslide that Dina mentioned is that democracy is incredibly fragile, and it's our job to ensure that we are holding these governments to commit to uphold their commitments globally, domestically, and to do so no matter what it takes.
Maybe as a follow-up question to that, for all of you, and continue Nadine's point, I'm wondering about what ways in which restrictions on individual writers, journalists, academics can often be seen as perhaps the first warning signs of potentially more significant restrictions on not only human rights, but also the weakening of democratic institutions, that it begins with these sort of targeted individuals, but then actually from there begin to sort of expand outwards once the governments see that they can get away with that.
I'm happy to start, but yes, we absolutely see them as, a warning sign. We saw this in Hungary with the Central European University, the effort to force its closure through onerous administrative burdens imposed by the government. This came first, and then sector-wide attacks on institutional autonomy, banning of gender studies, government takeover of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and the effective seizure of control of state universities. So the attack on Central European University was indeed, a warning sign. And we saw this in Turkey with the case of the Academics for Peace, where over 1,100 academic signatories to a petition faced criminal and administrative investigations, which then led to sector-wide attacks, including detentions, mass dismissals, blacklisting of scholars, travel bans, essentially a civil death of many academics in Turkey. I think what we need to take away from that, though, is that when the first voices are silenced, this is an opportunity for all of us to act, to take it seriously, to intervene diplomatically where it's possible, and at the very least, offer support to those individuals who fear staying, and enable, as I think Nadine mentioned, enable pathways to the United States and elsewhere that allow these individuals to continue their work safely.
Yeah, I agree with Claire. And I would just also say that I think at a basic level, when you have an informed citizenry, that begets government accountability. And if you don't have government accountability, you're going to have that backslide and that loss of democratic norms.
And I agree with that. And I would say that because I see journalists playing a role as the and writers, right, who are observing our world as it goes around us, and I think in a lot of ways they're the ears and eyes of society. They can reflect back to us what they see. They can help us understand uncomfortable truths, and we have to be okay with that. And so, yes, in a sense, kind of the canary in the coal mine, if you will, to mix metaphors, an early warning system, sounding the alarm. And unfortunately, I think often it's the local newspapers, it's the journalists who are working for the local media outlet who are the ones who notice the alarm signs going off. And maybe they don't feel heard until it makes national or international news. But I think good journalism is built on facts, and so if we do also need robust local networks, ecosystems of journalism, and that's also a worrying trend that we're seeing. And every time a journalist is arrested or detained, that we chip away at that foundation of truth a little bit more. And I worry about that a lot. So I think, and another point, we've talked a lot about holding governments to account, but I also think we need to hold media organizations where they can be held to a higher standard in terms of the journalism they provide, because we are seeing deliberate disinformation and misinformation campaigns, deliberate attempts to sow chaos. And I, when we talk about the role journalists and writers play in alerting us to the really big problematic things that are going on in our world, which can again feel overwhelming. My hope is that we don't see the signs until it's too late. That's why this is really important, that this briefing is happening today and why I'm grateful to the Commission and the partnership for giving us this opportunity, because I want to stand up and shout from the rooftops. Listen, watch, this is worrisome, folks, but there's still time.
So, a question from Kimberly Stanton. The U.S. is about to host a summit on democracy. Some of the participating countries will have poor records when it comes to protecting freedom of expression. What indicators or benchmarks would the panelists recommend to the administration and to participating countries for making sure that their own practices are consistent with the protection of the right to freedom of expression? What should improve before countries get invited back to the summits a year from now?
That's a really great question. And indeed, it's around the corner. I would like to give a shout out to the White House, which is the lead, has the lead in organizing it, because they have been very welcoming of civil society. They have gone to great lengths to make sure that civil society is included in the planning. That includes Reporters Without Borders. And I think not at all ever daring to speak for them, but I think they would be the first to acknowledge that they're aware that there will be problematic governments at the table. But I think in the spirit, again, not speaking for them, this is my kind of observation or assumption, is that operating in the spirit that you will bring people more on board and help them, incentivize them to join the community of nations, the international community, if they're given a seat at that table. And I think they're ready to address those concerns head on. And if you're interested, you can look up, RSF has something called our Information and Democracy Initiative, which encourages states to sign up to fortify democracy. It's got a whole bunch of measures and that I can't go into here because we're almost out of time. But the Information and Democracy Initiative, as well as our Journalism Trust Initiative, are two things you could go have a look at.
I would also note that I think that the question actually kind of has a great answer within it, which is that these countries need to put forth realistic, achievable goals, because we are looking at a 12-month process here, though hopefully will go longer, of course, as well, and for longer term commitments. But I would like to see these pragmatic, achievable goals that are actually meaningful. And if those goals are not achieved, and if there are, absent some kind of extenuating circumstance, but really releasing wrongfully detained prisoners should not be a difficult thing to do, right? We get that done. And then if they don't achieve them, then we should talk about how they should not be invited back, right? I think it's very important, as Anna noted, that we try to be be inclusive, have that conversation, and then use the course of the next year to ensure accountability and to have civil society engaged to better the outcome for the following year.
And just to add to that, in terms of benchmarks, I wanted to flag that there's a recently established academic freedom index that provides an assessment of academic freedom levels worldwide that can inform and guide policy and advocacy efforts. And as the administration is looking at potential benchmarks and indicators, we'd strongly recommend reviewing the AFI.
So just looking through some of the questions and trying to maybe bring a lot of them together for one final question. Everyone noted the impact that COVID restrictions have had and how that's served as a ruse to implement all sorts of restrictions on freedom of expression. But in the chats, people have also noted that there are cybercrime statutes, sedition laws, blasphemy laws that have been employed in Nigeria, I'm going to sort of forget other countries. But the one question that seems to come up over and over is what else can be done in opposition to those laws, given the range of them. It's not just COVID restrictions, but laws that are being crafted to fit the particular political terrain of each of these countries.
That is not an easy question to end on. We have 5 minutes. But I would just say that it's multifaceted. I think that to approach, to create some sort of structure that reinforces democratic space, that reinforces open space, that reinforces free expression and an open higher education sector is what is important. So instead of attacking the individual laws head on, I mean, if you can, great. But I think the important thing is to look at the structure of the governmental systems within each country and develop a set of, guidelines to help countries, build a free and more open space for discussion. And so some of those recommendations would, of course, relate to these specific laws, but adjusting the laws on their own will do no good. It's more of a structural issue, in my opinion, as vague and broad as that is.
I also think this is where it's the import of government engagement and diplomatic engagement is paramount. And we have to be able to use those levers to create the pressure that we need in order to see change. And we have to hold others to account, even when that means it's uncomfortable because of other various relational issues. So I think that that's something that we really would like to see in terms of what our members of Congress do, as well as from the White House and from the diplomatic corps.
I think both of those points make a lot of sense, and I think what we also see, to try to end on a message of hope as well, is that while yes, we are seeing cybercrime and all sorts of excuses, codified or not, being used to silence. I mean, that's the whole point of putting people in jail, right? It's to silence the truth. It's to crack down on freedoms. I mean, every single one of us has an interest in making sure that doesn't happen. And I think we have an opportunity right now, given the digital arena, and what we will see happening at a breakneck pace in terms of development, as we see kind of Facebook is now Meta, and all of these different spaces grow, morph, change, and become, have darker and darker corners. I think we need to right now is the time to stand up with those governments who do see a clear path. There are 43 of them that have signed the Partnership for Information and Democracy. We gathered them together for a ministerial level event in September, which in the middle of a pandemic, that's kind of a big deal that we got a lot of them together, and they included Argentina, Canada, Germany, India, Norway, South Africa, South Korea, the UK, others, with the goal of establishing regulations, the types of regulations that are needed in the digital space to safeguard freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to be informed. So, it is a really hard question to ask, especially when it's kind of when it's there and it's done and it's already being used to silence. So one thing that we can do is get this next thing right. And again, I think I don't think it's too much of a stretch of the imagination to say the future of humankind depends on it. I mean, yes, there's climate change, and there's a direct link between that and the right to be informed and journalism. All of these major challenges that we face. We need solidarity. We need truth. And we need to see journalists free to do their essential work, and express themselves as their profession entails.
I'm going to try to sneak in one last quick question for everybody, so it's not a hard one, Clara. Just to acknowledge Emily's question, what are some of the ways people can spread awareness about the conditions of imprisoned writers, scholars, and journalists? Very quickly.
So actually, earlier today, we had a wonderful panel on the Day of the Imprisoned Writer, and one of our panelists said, and someone who had been imprisoned, and they said that the solidarity and advocacy was really what kept them sane throughout their imprisonment. And social media has an incredible reach. We recognize the ills, of course, but that is one way people are able to express solidarity. And one way you put it, to Anna's point about the silencing, that is the point. He said, when we are detained, they were trying to make us forgotten. And when you stand in advocacy and solidarity with us, then you are remembering us. So I think that's one really important thing to think about in terms of what it means to be able to spread that information and to stand in solidarity with people.
I think that's an excellent point. I can't think of a better one, but I will also say that we should each look at the tools that we have within our professions, within our communities, and within our work, and use those. If you are a student, there are ways to get involved in Scholars at Risk's work. There are ways to get involved in PEN America's work, possibly RSF's, I'm not sure. And if you're a professor or a scholar or a human rights defender, or if you are just an individual who cares about these issues, social media is an excellent way to amplify the voice. Also, letters to individuals in prison, and there are several different organizations that can help you find addresses and individuals who you might specifically care about. But also, I guess I should just end with attending more briefings like this, coming to these events, demonstrating to our government and to each other that this matters is hugely important, especially as Anna had said earlier, that we, so much of what we hear these days is negative. We need to come together, work together, and amplify our voices.
Yeah, know that we're out here. We're out here. We need people like you who care, who really do. And you can talk to your, friends and family, and it's not easy. My goodness, it's not. But it's worth it for us, for future generations. That solidarity is really important, and one individual can make a difference. So, and thank you very much for having us. This was a real honor today.
Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us, and thank you to the Tom Lantos Commission for inviting all of us to be here today. It's been a pleasure having this conversation, and hopefully a better future.